I. The beginning of the nation-building journey. In the early 17th century, England was in the process of asserting its position as a major sea power. Many families, religious sects, and investors sought new lands, aiming both to gain wealth and to escape the social and religious constraints at home. In 1607, the Virginia Company expedition founded Jamestown in Virginia, the first permanent English settlement in North America. Facing famine, disease, harsh climate, and conflict with the native Powhatan people, Jamestown nearly perished many times. However, thanks to tobacco, a highly valuable cash crop for export, the settlement ultimately survived. Over the next century, 13 English colonies were gradually established along the Atlantic coast. Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Connecticut, Rhode Island, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. Each colony had its own purpose and characteristics. Some were religious havens for Puritans and Quakers. Others were established for commercial benefit, and some served as military buffers against Spain. But the common thread was that all sought the opportunity for freedom and a fresh start. 2. Social and economic life. The 13 colonies were divided into 3 regions, each with distinct characteristics. New England, north cold climate, poor soil, agriculture was not highly developed. People relied on fishing, trade, and shipbuilding. Communities were tightly knit by the Puritan Church, with strict discipline and a strong work ethic. Small towns, town meetings, and schools formed early, laying the groundwork for a spirit of democracy. Middle colonies, middle fertile land, temperate climate, fostering diverse agriculture. Wheat, grains, livestock. New York and Philadelphia became major commercial centers, attracting diverse immigrants: Dutch, German, Swedish, Irish, Jewish, Quaker, etc. This ethnic and religious diversity led the region to be more tolerant and open than the stricter New England. Southern colonies, south warm climate, vast land, suitable for large-scale plantations growing tobacco, cotton, rice, and indigo. The economy was dependent on black slave labor, imported from Africa via the slave trade triangle. Southern society was sharply stratified. The wealthy planter class dominated, while small farmers, free laborers, and slaves lived in hardship. Overall, the colonial economy grew rapidly, integrating into the global trade network. The ports of Boston, New York, and Philadelphia were bustling with ships, exporting goods to Europe while importing manufactured goods from England. This growth gave rise to a new middle class: merchants, lawyers, landowners, and intellectuals, who would later play a crucial role in the independence movement. 3. Spiritual life and culture. European immigrants brought their beliefs, customs, and knowledge from their homelands. Religion played a central role. In New England, the Puritan Church guided all community activities. In Pennsylvania, the Quaker sect emphasized equality and tolerance. In Maryland, Catholicism coexisted with Protestantism. Despite the differences, the shared value of religious freedom gradually became a core tenet. Education was valued early. Harvard University was founded in 1636, followed by Yale, Princeton, William and Mary, etc. These institutions trained the first American intellectual class, steeped in the Bible while absorbing Enlightenment philosophy. By the mid-18th century, the Great Awakening movement spread, a religious revival calling for virtuous and just living, promoting individualism and equality. This movement also helped foster a consciousness against imposed authority, sowing the seeds for democracy. Furthermore, newspapers, books, and discussion groups flourished. Local newspapers not only reported news, but also debated politics, disseminating Enlightenment ideals. Figures like Benjamin Franklin, a scientist, journalist, and statesman, became an icon of the colonial intellect. 4. Conflict with the mother country. Despite their strong growth, the American colonies remained under strict British control. The Navigation Acts forced them to trade only with Britain, restricting free commerce. The colonists, accustomed to self-governance, grew increasingly resentful of these constraints. Tension peaked after the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, when Britain defeated France, gaining control over Canada and vast lands in North America. However, the war drained the British treasury, leading the government to seek to raise taxes from the colonies. From the Stamp Act, 1765, to the Tea Act, 1773, the new laws met fierce opposition. Americans argued that they had no representation in the British Parliament, making the taxation illegal. The slogan "No taxation without representation" echoed everywhere, becoming a rallying cry. Events like the Boston Massacre, 1770, where British soldiers fired on civilians, and the Boston Tea Party, 1773, where colonists dumped cargo into the sea to protest the tax, transformed economic grievances into political conflict. The British government retaliated with punitive acts, further escalating the situation. National identity and the unity movement. In this context, colonial intellectuals and politicians played a pioneering role. Thomas Paine's pamphlet Common Sense, 1776, asserted that independence was inevitable, condemning the British monarchy as irrational. Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, and many others debated, wrote articles, organized conventions, and called for unity. Starting in 1774, the Continental Congresses were convened, gathering delegates from all 13 colonies for the first time. This was a turning point. From scattered communities, Americans began to realize they belonged to a shared entity with interconnected interests and future. Decisions to boycott British goods, organize militia forces, and call for unified resistance prepared the foundation for a full-scale revolution. 6. From protest to revolution. By 1775, the situation erupted into armed conflict. The clash at Lexington and Concord, where colonial militia confronted the British Army, is considered the opening shot of the American Revolution. Though initially scattered, the spirit of resistance spread rapidly. The colonists had spent over 150 years building self-reliance on the new land. They had created their own economy, a diverse society, and a distinct identity. They were no longer purely English, but American. Imposition from the mother country only further clarified their desire for freedom. All these factors converged, transforming the tax resistance movement into a struggle for independence. 7. Historical significance of the colonial period. The colonial period, lasting over 160 years, established the foundation for the United States. Economically, it formed a dynamic, diverse society with agriculture, trade, and handicraft industry. Politically, the practice of self-governance and community spirit served as a precursor to later democracy. Socioculturally, the blending of religions, Enlightenment thought, and the Great Awakening movement nurtured individualism and equality. In terms of national consciousness, fueled by conflict with the mother country, Americans realized they were no longer subjects of a distant kingdom, but a new people with aspirations for self-determination. Therefore, the colonial era was not just a preparation for the American Revolution, it was the gestation process of a nation, transforming from a group of adventurous immigrants into a community with a distinct identity, will, and belief in the future. The beginning of the nation-building journey. In the early 17th century, England was in the process of asserting its position as a major sea power. Many families, religious sects, and investors sought new lands, aiming both to gain wealth and to escape the social and religious constraints at home. In 1607, the Virginia Company expedition founded Jamestown in Virginia, the first permanent English settlement in North America. Facing famine, disease, harsh climate, and conflict with the native Powhatan people, Jamestown nearly perished many times. However, thanks to tobacco, a highly valuable cash crop for export, the settlement ultimately survived. Over the next century, 13 English colonies were gradually established along the Atlantic coast. Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Connecticut, Rhode Island, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. Each colony had its own purpose and characteristics. Some were religious havens for Puritans and Quakers. Others were established for commercial benefit, and some served as military buffers against Spain. But the common thread was that all sought the opportunity for freedom and a fresh start. 2. Social and economic life. The 13 colonies were divided into 3 regions, each with distinct characteristics. New England, north cold climate, poor soil, agriculture was not highly developed. People relied on fishing, trade, and shipbuilding. Communities were tightly knit by the Puritan Church, with strict discipline and a strong work ethic. Small towns, town meetings, and schools formed early, laying the groundwork for a spirit of democracy. Middle colonies, middle fertile land, temperate climate, fostering diverse agriculture. Wheat, grains, livestock. New York and Philadelphia became major commercial centers, attracting diverse immigrants: Dutch, German, Swedish, Irish, Jewish, Quaker, etc. This ethnic and religious diversity led the region to be more tolerant and open than the stricter New England. Southern colonies, south warm climate, vast land, suitable for large-scale plantations growing tobacco, cotton, rice, and indigo. The economy was dependent on black slave labor, imported from Africa via the slave trade triangle. Southern society was sharply stratified. The wealthy planter class dominated, while small farmers, free laborers, and slaves lived in hardship. Overall, the colonial economy grew rapidly, integrating into the global trade network. The ports of Boston, New York, and Philadelphia were bustling with ships, exporting goods to Europe while importing manufactured goods from England. This growth gave rise to a new middle class: merchants, lawyers, landowners, and intellectuals, who would later play a crucial role in the independence movement. 3. Spiritual life and culture. European immigrants brought their beliefs, customs, and knowledge from their homelands. Religion played a central role. In New England, the Puritan Church guided all community activities. In Pennsylvania, the Quaker sect emphasized equality and tolerance. In Maryland, Catholicism coexisted with Protestantism. Despite the differences, the shared value of religious freedom gradually became a core tenet. Education was valued early. Harvard University was founded in 1636, followed by Yale, Princeton, William and Mary, etc. These institutions trained the first American intellectual class, steeped in the Bible while absorbing Enlightenment philosophy. By the mid-18th century, the Great Awakening movement spread, a religious revival calling for virtuous and just living, promoting individualism and equality. This movement also helped foster a consciousness against imposed authority, sowing the seeds for democracy. Furthermore, newspapers, books, and discussion groups flourished. Local newspapers not only reported news, but also debated politics, disseminating Enlightenment ideals. Figures like Benjamin Franklin, a scientist, journalist, and statesman, became an icon of the colonial intellect. 4. Conflict with the mother country. Despite their strong growth, the American colonies remained under strict British control. The Navigation Acts forced them to trade only with Britain, restricting free commerce. The colonists, accustomed to self-governance, grew increasingly resentful of these constraints. Tension peaked after the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, when Britain defeated France, gaining control over Canada and vast lands in North America. However, the war drained the British treasury, leading the government to seek to raise taxes from the colonies. From the Stamp Act, 1765, to the Tea Act, 1773, the new laws met fierce opposition. Americans argued that they had no representation in the British Parliament, making the taxation illegal. The slogan "No taxation without representation" echoed everywhere, becoming a rallying cry. Events like the Boston Massacre, 1770, where British soldiers fired on civilians, and the Boston Tea Party, 1773, where colonists dumped cargo into the sea to protest the tax, transformed economic grievances into political conflict. The British government retaliated with punitive acts, further escalating the situation. National identity and the unity movement. In this context, colonial intellectuals and politicians played a pioneering role. Thomas Paine's pamphlet Common Sense, 1776, asserted that independence was inevitable, condemning the British monarchy as irrational. Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, and many others debated, wrote articles, organized conventions, and called for unity. Starting in 1774, the Continental Congresses were convened, gathering delegates from all 13 colonies for the first time. This was a turning point. From scattered communities, Americans began to realize they belonged to a shared entity with interconnected interests and future. Decisions to boycott British goods, organize militia forces, and call for unified resistance prepared the foundation for a full-scale revolution. 6. From protest to revolution. By 1775, the situation erupted into armed conflict. The clash at Lexington and Concord, where colonial militia confronted the British Army, is considered the opening shot of the American Revolution. Though initially scattered, the spirit of resistance spread rapidly. The colonists had spent over 150 years building self-reliance on the new land. They had created their own economy, a diverse society, and a distinct identity. They were no longer purely English, but American. Imposition from the mother country only further clarified their desire for freedom. All these factors converged, transforming the tax resistance movement into a struggle for independence. 7. Historical significance of the colonial period. The colonial period, lasting over 160 years, established the foundation for the United States. Economically, it formed a dynamic, diverse society with agriculture, trade, and handicraft industry. Politically, the practice of self-governance and community spirit served as a precursor to later democracy. Socioculturally, the blending of religions, Enlightenment thought, and the Great Awakening movement nurtured individualism and equality. In terms of national consciousness, fueled by conflict with the mother country, Americans realized they were no longer subjects of a distant kingdom, but a new people with aspirations for self-determination. Therefore, the colonial era was not just a preparation for the American Revolution, it was the gestation process of a nation, transforming from a group of adventurous immigrants into a community with a distinct identity, will, and belief in the future. Dưới đây là bản dịch tiếng Anh của chương 3, Mở rộng lãnh thổ và nội chiến, 1789-1865. Chapter 3, Territorial Expansion and the Civil War, 1789-1865. The initial steps of the United States. Following the ratification of the Constitution in 1787, the United States of America officially embarked on its nation-building trajectory. George Washington became the first president, 1789 to 1797, laying the foundation for the presidential role in a young democratic system. He not only consolidated the government apparatus, but also affirmed a crucial principle. The president is not a king. Supreme power belongs to the people and is limited by the Constitution. Successive presidents, from John Adams and Thomas Jefferson to James Madison and James Monroe, all faced challenges both domestic and international. But the notable feature was this. The United States did not stop at the original 13 states. It rapidly expanded its territory westward, realizing its aspiration to become a continental power. 2. The Louisiana Purchase and the ambition for expansion. In 1803, under President Thomas Jefferson, the U.S. purchased the Louisiana Territory from France for $15 million. This deal doubled the size of the U.S. and opened the door for massive westward migration. Expeditions, most notably led by Lewis and Clark, 1804 to 1806, surveyed the new land, mapped it, described the flora and fauna, and established contact with the native populations. The Louisiana Purchase was a turning point. It not only expanded the area, but also affirmed that the U.S. could negotiate on equal terms with European powers. From this point, the concept of manifest destiny began to emerge. The belief that Americans were destined to explore, dominate, and civilize the entire continent from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean. 3. The Road West and the Tragedy of the Native Americans. In the first half of the 19th century, hundreds of thousands of Americans, left the crowded East to move west. They traveled by wagon, crossing the Appalachian Mountains, the Central Plains, deserts, and the Rocky Mountains. Routes like the Oregon Trail and the Santa Fe Trail became legendary. This migration brought many opportunities: vast lands, flourishing agriculture, new towns springing up, and bustling trade economies. But it was accompanied by tragedy for the Native American population. The U.S. government repeatedly signed, then broke, treaties, forcing tribes off their ancestral lands to make way for white settlers. The most sorrowful event was the Trail of Tears, 1830s, when tens of thousands of Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole people were forcibly relocated west of the Mississippi River. Thousands died from hunger, disease, and freezing conditions along the way. This remains an indelible stain on the history of U.S. territorial expansion. 4. Conflicts with Great Britain and Mexico. During its expansion, the U.S. also clashed with other powers. In 1812, the U.S. and Great Britain entered the War of 1812, primarily centered on maritime rights and the Canadian border territory. Although the war ended without a clear victory for either side, it helped consolidate American national spirit and affirmed that the U.S. could confront a major European power. Subsequently, the U.S. turned its attention south and southwest, where Mexico controlled Texas and California. In 1836, Texas revolted and gained independence from Mexico, later joining the U.S., 1845. This led to the Mexican-American War, 1846 to 1848. With superior strength, the U.S. quickly won, and under the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, Mexico was forced to cede a huge region to the U.S., including California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, and parts of Colorado and Wyoming. Thus, in just a few decades, U.S. territory stretched from the Atlantic coast to the Pacific coast, truly becoming a continental superpower. V. Economic boom and the gold rush. Territorial expansion was accompanied by economic development. The Transcontinental Railroad, the Erie Canal, and a new transportation system transformed the U.S. into a unified market. Agriculture in the Midwest and West provided grain, meat, and cotton, while eastern cities developed industry, trade, and banking. In 1848, news of gold discovery in California erupted, triggering the California Gold Rush. Hundreds of thousands of people flocked to the West from all over the world seeking their fortune. Although only a few became rich, the movement rapidly spurred California's development, and just 2 years later, 1850, the state joined the Union. 6. The North-South conflict and the slavery issue. However, alongside the development was a fierce conflict between the North and the South. The North, rapidly industrializing, relied on free labor and increasingly opposed slavery, viewing it as inhumane and an obstacle to progress. The South, its plantation economy relied on slavery to grow cotton, tobacco, and sugarcane. Wealthy plantation owners viewed slavery as essential. Every time the U.S. expanded into new territory, the big question arose: will the new state be a free state or a slave state? This debate caused deep divisions in Congress and throughout society. Temporary compromises such as the Missouri Compromise, 1820, and the Compromise of 1850 merely delayed the conflict. But tensions escalated, especially as the abolitionism movement spread in the North, with prominent figures like Frederick Douglass, escaped slave, orator, Harriet Beecher Stowe, author of Uncle Tom's Cabin, and William Lloyd Garrison, journalist, activist. 7. The road to civil war. The 1850s witnessed intense polarization. The newly formed Republican Party, with its anti-slavery expansion stance, grew stronger. Meanwhile, the South rigidly defended its peculiar institution. In 1857, the Supreme Court's Dred Scott decision ruled that black people, whether free or slave, were not considered U.S. citizens. This decision added fuel to the fire, triggering an explosion of protest in the North. In 1860, Abraham Lincoln, the Republican candidate, was elected president. Lincoln opposed the expansion of slavery, although initially he did not call for its complete abolition. This led many Southern states to fear their interests were threatened, and they decided to secede from the Union, forming the Confederate States of America in 1861, with its capital in Richmond, Virginia. 8. The outbreak of Civil War, 1861 to 1865. In April 1861, Confederate forces attacked Fort Sumter in South Carolina, starting the American Civil War, the bloodiest conflict in U.S. history. The North, Union more populous, strong industry, developed railway system, and better finances. The South, Confederacy high fighting spirit, experienced officers, but dependent on agriculture and little industry. Initially, the South won many victories. But from 1863, a turning point occurred when Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring the freedom of all slaves in the rebellious states. Although many slaves were not immediately freed in reality, this document transformed the war from one to preserve the Union into a war for freedom, raising its moral significance and removing any reason for Great Britain and France to support the South. The battles of Gettysburg, 1863, Atlanta, 1864, and General Sherman's march to the sea gradually strangled the South. Finally, in April 1865, Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered at Appomattox. The Union was preserved, and slavery was abolished. Just days after the victory, President Lincoln was assassinated, leaving a huge void in the work of Reconstruction. 9. Significance of the era of expansion and Civil War. From 1789 to 1865, the United States underwent tremendous upheaval. It became a transcontinental nation, stretching from the Atlantic to the Pacific. It asserted its power against European powers and Mexico. Its economy developed robustly through industry, agriculture, and trade. But it also paid the price of a devastating civil war, with over 600,000 deaths. The outcome of the Civil War was not only national reunification, but also the affirmation of an immutable principle. The United States is an indivisible union where freedom and equality are fundamental values. Chapter 4. Industrialization and Immigration, 1865 to 1914. The dawn of a new era after the Civil War. The year 1865 marked the end of the Civil War, and the United States entered the period of Reconstruction. The Union was preserved and slavery was officially abolished, yet American society still grappled with deep wounds. The South was devastated, its economy ruined, and millions of newly freed slaves lacked land and employment. Meanwhile, the North, with its rising industrial base, quickly became the main engine propelling the U.S. into a new era, the age of industrialization. The United States was now a vast, unified nation, boasting enormous natural resources, an abundant labor force, and a more stable political system. All of these conditions allowed the U.S. to develop at breakneck speed during the latter half of the 19th century. 2. Industrial boom and scientific inventions. From 1865 to 1900, the U.S. witnessed an unprecedented industrial explosion, known as the Second Industrial Revolution. Railroads. The railway network grew rapidly, connecting the east and west coasts and transforming the U.S. into a unified market. In 1869, the Transcontinental Railroad was completed, ushering in an era of swift transport for goods and people, boosting trade, resource extraction, and urban expansion. Steel, oil, and electricity. The steel industry, under the guidance of Andrew Carnegie, became the backbone for constructing railroads, bridges, and skyscrapers. Oil, exploited by John D. Rockefeller and his Standard Oil Company, became a crucial energy source. Electricity, with inventions by Thomas Edison, light bulb, phonograph, and Nikola Tesla, alternating current, revolutionized daily life and industrial production. Communication and telecommunications. Inventions like Alexander Graham Bell's telephone, the typewriter, and new printing systems helped information spread quickly. Media and newspaper companies flourished, creating a broader information society. These inventions not only transformed the economy, but also fundamentally altered all aspects of American social life, from production and business to daily living. 3. The rise of corporations and big capitalists. Industrial development led to the formation of massive corporations and the class of big capitalists, robber barons. John D. Rockefeller, Standard Oil, controlled virtually the entire oil industry. Andrew Carnegie dominated the steel industry. J.P. Morgan became the titan of finance and banking. Cornelius Vanderbilt amassed his fortune through railroads and shipping. They built their empires through fierce, sometimes ruthless competition, yet they were also the pioneers of modern industry. Some later became philanthropists, funding schools, libraries, and research institutions. This period is also known as the Gilded Age. Glittering on the outside, but fraught with injustice, wealth disparity, and political corruption on the inside. While the great capitalists accumulated enormous fortunes, millions of workers toiled in harsh conditions. Low wages, long hours, and poor safety standards. 4. The labor movement and social reform. Economic injustice spurred the birth of labor unions and the labor movement. Organizations like the Knights of Labor and later the American Federation of Labor, AFL, campaigned for reduced working hours, higher wages, and improved working conditions. Numerous major strikes erupted, such as the Great Railroad Strike of 1877 and the Homestead Strike of 1892, sometimes leading to violence and suppression. Alongside this, the progressivism movement emerged in the early 20th century, demanding political reform, control over corporate monopolies, and protection for the rights of workers, women, and children. This laid the groundwork for many subsequent social policies. The massive wave of immigration. From 1870 to 1914, the U.S. welcomed tens of millions of immigrants, primarily from Europe, Ireland, Italy, Germany, Poland, Russia, and Asia, China, Japan. They came to America hoping for the American dream, a place where they could achieve upward mobility through hard work. Cities like New York, Chicago, Boston, and San Francisco became the main destinations. Immigrants worked in factories, built railroads, and mined coal. They brought their cultures, languages, cuisines, and religions, contributing to the diversity of American society. However, the immigration wave also sparked conflict. Native-born Americans feared losing jobs, leading to anti-immigrant movements. The Chinese Exclusion Act, 1882, was the first federal law to restrict immigration, directly targeting the Chinese. Despite this, America continued to be the promised land for millions worldwide. 6. Urbanization and social change. Industrialization and immigration fueled urbanization. Large cities sprang up with skyscrapers, industrial zones, and working-class neighborhoods. The urban population grew rapidly, but this was accompanied by issues like pollution, crime, and slums. Meanwhile, culture and social life also changed. Education expanded, with many public schools being built. Women began to participate more in the workforce and the suffrage movement, demanding the right to vote. Arts and science flourished, with authors like Mark Twain reflecting social realities and artists and musicians bringing the American spirit to the world. 7. America reaches out to the world. By the late 19th century, the U.S. was not only an industrial power, but also began to expand its influence globally. In 1898, the U.S. fought and won the Spanish-American War, gaining control of Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines, and strong influence in Cuba. Hawaii was annexed, extending U.S. influence in the Pacific. The open door policy towards China demonstrated America's global trade ambitions. Thus, from a former colony, the U.S. transformed into a rising empire, stepping onto the international stage. 8. From the American dream to social challenges. The era of industrialization brought unprecedented opportunity and wealth, creating the image of the American dream, a place where anyone could succeed through effort. However, reality was far more complex. While some found success, millions of workers lived in poverty, children worked in factories, women lacked the right to vote, and Black Americans in the South continued to face discrimination under the Jim Crow laws. The contradiction between the ideal and the reality generated the momentum for reform movements, setting the stage for major changes in the 20th century. Conclusion of Chapter 4. From 1865 to 1914, the United States underwent a total transformation, from an agricultural nation ravaged by the Civil War to the world's leading industrial power. The industrial boom, the wave of immigration, urbanization, and international expansion shaped the new face of America. This period laid the foundation for its later role as a superpower, while also exposing deep-seated social issues, inequality, discrimination, and labor conflict, that the U.S. would continue to confront in the 20th century. Tất nhiên rồi, đây là bản dịch tiếng Anh của chương 5, Hai cuộc thế chiến và khủng hoảng, 1914-1945. Chapter 5. Two World Wars and the Depression, 1914 to 1945. The context of the early 20th century. At the beginning of the 20th century, the United States had risen to become the world's leading industrial and commercial power. Cities were bustling, the population was rapidly increasing, and the steel, coal, oil, and electricity industries saw phenomenal growth. Americans began to feel more confident on the international stage, evidenced by their victory in the Spanish-American War, 1898, and the expansion of territory in the Pacific and the Caribbean. However, many injustices persisted within American society. Racial segregation in the South, harsh labor conditions in factories, and the lack of suffrage for women. It was against this backdrop that the progressive movement flourished in the early 20th century, introducing reforms aimed at curbing monopolies, improving workers' lives, protecting the environment, and promoting democracy. As the U.S. entered World War I, 1914, it was a nation full of ambition yet burdened by internal contradictions. 2. World War I, 1914 to 1918. When World War I erupted in Europe in 1914, the U.S. initially maintained a stance of neutrality. President Woodrow Wilson believed the U.S. should avoid conflict and focus on domestic development. However, the sinking of the British liner Lusitania by a German U-boat, 1915, along with Germany's unrestricted submarine warfare campaign against passenger ships, outraged American public opinion. The turning point was the Zimmermann Telegram, 1917, in which Germany proposed an alliance with Mexico against the U.S., forcing the United States to act. In April 1917, Wilson declared war on Germany, formally entering the U.S. into World War I. The arrival of the U.S. with its immense resources, troops, food, and weaponry marked a turning point for the Allied powers. By 1918, Germany and its allies were exhausted and forced to surrender. After the war, Wilson proposed his 14 points, highlighted by the establishment of the League of Nations to ensure world peace. However, the U.S. Senate refused to join, reflecting a strong sentiment of isolationism. Nevertheless, the global role of the U.S. was firmly established from this point forward. 3. The 1920s, prosperity and contradictions. Following the war, the U.S. entered the 1920s with dazzling economic development, a period famously known as the Roaring Twenties. Automotive industry. Henry Ford's assembly line revolutionized production, making the automobile a mass-market product. Film and jazz. Hollywood became the global center for cinema. Jazz spread everywhere, creating a new American cultural era. Women. In 1920, the 19th Amendment granted women the right to vote, opening a new chapter for the feminist movement. Urban life. Cities grew, modern lifestyles and consumer spending surged, and sports and entertainment flourished. However, the prosperity masked many contradictions. Farmers suffered from plummeting agricultural prices. African Americans migrated from the South to northern cities, Great Migration, yet still faced racial discrimination. The Ku Klux Klan revived, spreading violence and hatred. Crucially, widespread financial speculation and debt laid the foundation for a catastrophic crisis. 4. The Great Depression, 1929 to 1939. On October 29, 1929, known as Black Tuesday, the Wall Street stock market crashed. This shock triggered a wave of bank failures, soaring unemployment, and plunged millions of families into poverty. Throughout the 1930s, the Great Depression gripped the United States and spread globally. To salvage the situation, President Franklin D. Roosevelt initiated the New Deal program, 1933. This was a series of major socioeconomic reforms: creation of public works jobs, building bridges, roads, hydroelectric dams, support for farmers, and regulation of agricultural production, banking reform and deposit insurance, strengthening union rights, and improving workers' living standards. The New Deal did not completely end the Depression but restored public confidence and laid the foundation for a federal government with a more active role in social life. World War II, 1939 to 1945. When World War II erupted in Europe, 1939, the U.S. initially maintained a neutral stance. But the event of December 7, 1941, when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, changed everything. The next day, the U.S. declared war on Japan and subsequently on Germany and Italy. The United States officially entered the largest conflict in human history. Pacific Theater. The U.S. military gradually counterattacked from Midway, 1942, Guadalcanal, advancing across the islands, closing in on Japan. The industrial strength of the U.S. Navy reversed the situation. European Theater. The U.S. joined Britain in campaigns in North Africa, 1942, and then invaded Italy, 1943. On June 6, 1944, D-Day, the Allies landed in Normandy, opening the Western Front. By 1945, U.S. forces advanced into Germany from the west, coordinating with the Soviet Union from the east, forcing the Nazi regime to surrender. End of the war. In the Pacific, the U.S. dropped 2 atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, August 1945, leading to Japan's unconditional surrender. World War II was over. 6. The United States becomes a superpower. After World War II, the United States emerged with an unprecedented status. Its economy was undamaged, unlike those in Europe and Asia. The U.S. military possessed the world's first nuclear weapons. The U.S. played a key role in founding the United Nations, 1945, to maintain international peace. The victory in World War II not only consolidated the U.S.'s global position, but also ushered in the Cold War era with the Soviet Union, laying the groundwork for new challenges in the second half of the 20th century. Conclusion of Chapter 5. The period from 1914 to 1945 was one of the most turbulent in U.S. history. From maintaining a peripheral role, the U.S. became a decisive force in both world wars. Interspersed between these conflicts were the Great Depression and the sweeping reforms of the New Deal, which helped the nation overcome the crisis and reshape the federal government. By the end of World War II, the United States had transformed from a regional power into a global superpower, ready to step into the Cold War era. Tuyệt vời! Đây là bản dịch tiếng Anh của chương 6, Chiến tranh lạnh và biến động xã hội, 1945-1989, được cấu trúc và định dạng tương tự như văn bản gốc. Chapter 6. The Cold War and Social Upheaval, 1945 to 1989. Entering the Cold War era. In 1945, World War II ended, and the United States emerged as the world's foremost superpower. Its powerful economy, modern military, and possession of nuclear weapons gave the U.S. a decisive advantage. However, the post-war international order was unstable. The Soviet Union, its former wartime ally, now became its greatest ideological rival. The U.S. represented capitalism and democracy, while the Soviet Union espoused communism and totalitarianism. The conflict between the two superpowers quickly escalated into a global standoff known as the Cold War. Instead of a direct, full-scale confrontation, the U.S. and the Soviet Union competed through arms races, the space race, and vying for political and economic influence, resulting in numerous proxy wars around the world. 2. Foreign policy, the containment of communism. To counter the Soviet Union, the U.S. adopted the containment strategy, primarily championed by George Kennan. The objective was to prevent the spread of communism. Marshall Plan, 1947, provided tens of billions of dollars in aid to help Western Europe recover from the war, simultaneously strengthening democratic governments. NATO, 1949. The U.S. and its allies formed the North Atlantic Treaty Organization to counter the Soviet threat. Korean War, 1950 to 1953. The U.S. deployed troops to defend South Korea against an attack from North Korea, which was backed by the Soviet Union and China. The war ended in an armistice, leaving the Korean peninsula divided to this day. Throughout the decades of the 1950s, 1980s, the U.S. intervened deeply in regions like Southeast Asia, the Middle East, and Latin America, all in an effort to curb communist influence. 3. The Vietnam War, a deep scar. The most significant conflict was the Vietnam War, 1955 to 1975. With the goal of preventing the domino effect, the U.S. sent hundreds of thousands of soldiers to fight in South Vietnam. However, the protracted and brutal war caused massive losses in lives and resources. Domestically, the war caused fierce divisions. The anti-war movement flourished, especially among the youth and intellectuals. Protests, anti-war songs, and painful images from the battlefield eroded public trust. Ultimately, the U.S. signed the Paris Peace Accords in 1973 and withdrew its troops, and the Saigon government fell in 1975. The Vietnam War left a major scar on American society, leading to widespread skepticism about the government and its foreign policy. 4. The arms and space race. Throughout the Cold War, the U.S. and the Soviet Union engaged in an intense arms race. Both developed colossal nuclear arsenals with the potential for global annihilation. The constant risk of nuclear war loomed over humanity, particularly during the Cuban Missile Crisis, 1962, when the world stood on the brink of nuclear conflict. In parallel, the two superpowers competed in the space race. The Soviet Union launched the Sputnik satellite, 1957, and put Yuri Gagarin into space as the first human, 1961. In response, the U.S. invested heavily in the Apollo program. In 1969, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin became the first humans to walk on the moon, marking a symbolic victory for the U.S. Domestic social upheaval. While facing external confrontation, the U.S. also underwent major internal social changes. The Civil Rights Movement. African Americans, after centuries of slavery and racial segregation, rose up to fight for equal rights. Figures like Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, and Rosa Parks became iconic. Protests, marches, and the famous "I Have a Dream" speech, 1963, led to crucial legislation. The Civil Rights Act, 1964, and the Voting Rights Act, 1965, which abolished Jim Crow laws and secured voting rights. The women's movement. Women fought for equality in labor, education, and politics. Organizations like NOW, National Organization for Women, advocated for reproductive rights and opposed gender discrimination. Counterculture. The 1960s, 1970s saw a strong wave of counterculture. The hippie movement, rock music, the anti-Vietnam War protests, and the environmental movement all profoundly reshaped American cultural life. 6. Politics and economy, from Cold War to crisis. After World War II, the U.S. entered a period of prosperity. The 1950s are often called the golden age of the middle class, marked by suburban homes, cars, television, and a rising standard of living. However, economic crises emerged starting in the 1970s. Soaring oil prices, inflation, and unemployment. Political highlights. 1950s. President Eisenhower maintained the containment policy. 1960s. Kennedy and Johnson focused on the civil rights movement but became entangled in Vietnam. 1970s. President Nixon faced the Watergate scandal, forcing his resignation, 1974. a major shock to political trust. 1980s, President Ronald Reagan initiated Reaganomics. Tax cuts increased defense spending, boosting the economy and intensifying pressure on the Soviet Union. 7. The collapse of the Cold War. By the late 1980s, the Soviet Union was weakening, while the U.S. recovered strongly economically and militarily. Reagan and later George H.W. Bush continued to increase pressure. Simultaneously, pro-democracy movements arose in Eastern Europe. In 1989, the Berlin Wall fell, symbolizing the end of the Cold War divide. The Soviet Union was also on the verge of collapse. The U.S. emerged as the sole superpower, opening a new era in world history. Conclusion Chapter 6. The period from 1945 to 1989 was the era of the Cold War, a global confrontation between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. Employing the containment strategy, the U.S. engaged in numerous conflicts, including the Korean War, and especially the Vietnam War. Domestically, the U.S. witnessed the rise of the civil rights movement, women's rights, social counterculture, alongside political and economic turmoil. Despite numerous challenges, the United States persevered, and as the Cold War concluded, it stood firm as the world's single global superpower. Chắc chắn rồi, đây là bản dịch tiếng Anh của chương 7, siêu cường đơn cực và toàn cầu hóa, 1990-2000. Chapter 7. The Unipolar Superpower and Globalization, 1990-2000. The post-Cold War world. In 1991, the Soviet Union disintegrated, officially marking the end of the Cold War. On the international political map, the United States emerged as the sole superpower. For the first time in modern history, the world entered a unipolar order. Major rivals gradually disappeared. Many nations transitioned to market economies and democratization, while American cultural, economic, and political influence spread globally. Americans entered the 1990s with a sense of triumph. The economy recovered robustly after the 1970-80 crises, information technology boomed, and the U.S. military demonstrated its overwhelming power in the Persian Gulf War, 1991. From this point on, the U.S. was not just a political and military center, but also the symbol of globalization. 2. Politics, from Bush Sr. to Clinton. George H.W. Bush, 1989 to 1993. Bush Sr. led the U.S. through a pivotal period, ending the Cold War, German reunification, and the dissolution of the Eastern Bloc. In 1991, he launched Operation Desert Storm, the Gulf War, to repel Iraqi forces from Kuwait. With extensive international coordination, the campaign achieved rapid success, showcasing America's dominant military might. However, domestic economic recession led to his defeat in the 1992 election. Bill Clinton, 1993 to 2001. Clinton represented a new generation of leadership, focusing on domestic reforms and promoting globalization. The Clinton administration signed the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, 1994, expanding trade between the U.S., Canada, and Mexico. He also facilitated the Middle East peace process and intervened in the Balkan conflicts, Bosnia, Kosovo. Despite his term being marred by the Monica Lewinsky scandal and subsequent impeachment proceedings, Clinton maintained public support, leading the U.S. into the new millennium with a strong economy. 3. Economy, globalization, and the Internet. The 1990s were a period when the U.S. witnessed impressive economic growth, driven by three major factors. Globalization. The U.S. expanded trade and investment worldwide. Multinational corporations like Microsoft, Coca-Cola, McDonald's, and Nike became global icons. Information technology. Personal computers became widespread, and the Internet exploded, creating a revolution in communication, commerce, and education. Silicon Valley became the center of innovation. Stock market boom. The dot-com wave in the late 1990s caused technology stocks to skyrocket, fueling an unprecedented investment frenzy. As a result, the U.S. entered a period of budget surplus, unemployment dropped, and the standard of living rose. This era is often called the golden age of the modern American economy. 4. Pop culture. America conquers the world. If economics and politics made the U.S. a superpower, pop culture made it the center of the global imagination. Music. American pop, hip-hop, and rock dominated international charts. Michael Jackson, Madonna, Nirvana, Tupac, and Britney Spears became global idols. Cinema. Hollywood entered the blockbuster era with Jurassic Park, Titanic, and The Matrix. Superstars like Tom Hanks, Julia Roberts, and Will Smith brought the American image everywhere. Fashion and lifestyle. Blue jeans, fast food, and global chain stores became symbols of American culture. Sports. NBA basketball, MLB baseball, and the 1996 Atlanta Olympics elevated American sports to peak influence. It was often said, "When the world turns on the TV, they are watching America." Challenges within the superpower. Despite its vigorous rise, American society in the 1990s still faced significant issues. Racial tensions. Although the civil rights movement achieved much, riots like the Los Angeles unrest, 1992, after the police beating of Rodney King showed that deep-seated inequality persisted. Gun violence. The Columbine High School massacre, 1999, shocked the public, initiating a prolonged debate over gun control. International terrorism. Attacks on U.S. embassies in Africa, 1998, and the World Trade Center bombing, 1993, signaled new security challenges in the era of globalization. 6. The U.S. and the world, the global gatekeeper. In its role as the sole superpower, the U.S. became increasingly involved in international conflicts. Supporting the Israeli-Palestinian peace process, Oslo Accords 1993. Intervening in Bosnia, 1995, and Kosovo, 1999, to stop ethnic cleansing. Maintaining the free trade order and securing global shipping lanes and the global economy. For many, the U.S. was the world's police, a force both relied upon and criticized. 7. Significance of the unipolar era. The 1990 to 2000 period can be considered America's golden decade. No longer facing a superpower rival. Strong economic growth and a technology boom. American culture dominating globally. The U.S. military was present everywhere, maintaining world order. However, within this prosperity, the seeds of challenge were also sown. International terrorism, the technology bubble, and social inequality. These issues would erupt violently as the United States entered the 21st century. Conclusion of Chapter 7. In the 1990s, the United States experienced an unprecedented period. A unipolar superpower leading the global economy, politics, and culture. Globalization and the Internet transformed the U.S. into the center of the modern world. Yet, behind this glow lay simmering challenges, foreshadowing the turbulent period of the 21st century. Chapter 8. The 21st Century and New Challenges, 2001 present. The United States on the threshold of the 21st century. As the year 2000 began, the United States was a global superpower with an unprecedented position. The world's strongest economy, advanced technology, a formidable military, and globally pervasive popular culture. However, the economy was also facing the dot-com technology bubble, and society grappled with various issues. Rising inequality, political polarization, and unforeseen new security risks. Americans entered the 21st century with confidence after the golden decade of the 1990s, but shortly thereafter, horrific events profoundly altered the nation's history. 2. September 11, 2001. The tragic turning point. On the morning of September 11, 2001, four commercial airplanes hijacked by the Al-Qaeda terrorist group crashed into the World Trade Center, New York, and the Pentagon, Washington, D.C., killing nearly 3,000 people. This was the deadliest terrorist attack in U.S. history, sending shockwaves across the globe. From that moment, U.S. domestic and foreign policy fundamentally changed. Domestically, the government enacted the Patriot Act, expanding surveillance and security powers. Globally, President George W. Bush declared the War on Terror, targeting al-Qaeda and the regimes that sheltered it. 3. The wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. In October 2001, the U.S. and its allies launched the war in Afghanistan, overthrowing the Taliban regime, which had hosted al-Qaeda. Initially successful, the war subsequently dragged on for 2 decades, becoming the longest war in U.S. history. In 2003, the Bush administration further initiated the Iraq War, citing Saddam Hussein's alleged possession of weapons of mass destruction. Although U.S. forces quickly occupied Baghdad, no evidence of such weapons was found. The war became mired in conflict, caused heavy casualties, diminished U.S. credibility, and created a vacuum for extremist ideologies to emerge, notably the Islamic State, ISIS. The 2 Middle East wars cost trillions of dollars and deeply divided American society. 4. The 2008 financial crisis. After years of growth, the U.S. economy plunged into the global financial crisis of 2008, originating in the housing and credit markets. Major banks collapsed, the stock market plummeted, and millions lost their jobs and homes. President Barack Obama, elected in 2008, faced immense challenges. His administration implemented an economic rescue package, bank reforms, and launched the Obamacare program to expand health insurance. Obama became the first African-American president, symbolizing social progress, but also encountered fierce opposition from the conservative faction. Political polarization and the populist wave. Entering the 2010s, American society witnessed increasingly deep polarization. The Democratic Party favored social reform, equality, and immigration. The Republican Party emphasized conservatism, nationalism, and anti-globalization. This division was evident in the 2016 election, when Donald Trump was elected with the slogan, "Make America Great Again." The Trump administration implemented an America First policy, withdrawing from several international agreements, imposing trade tariffs, tightening immigration, while simultaneously fueling a populist wave. U.S. politics became highly tense, marked by numerous protests, social conflicts, and a crisis of confidence in democratic institutions. 6. Social challenges and civil movements. The 21st century also saw the rise of new social movements. Black Lives Matter, 2013 protesting police brutality and racial discrimination, spreading widely after police killings of Black individuals. The #MeToo feminist movement, 2017 condemning sexual harassment and promoting gender equality. Gun crisis, mass shootings like those in Las Vegas, 2017 and Parkland School, 2018, ignited intense debates over gun ownership rights. Furthermore, issues like climate change, migration, and economic inequality became hot-button topics, dividing the political landscape and society. 7. Technology, globalization, and new competition. In the first 2 decades of the 21st century, U.S. technology continued to lead the world. Apple, Google, Facebook, and Amazon became global corporations, shaping daily life. Social media revolutionized communication, but also sparked concerns about misinformation, political division, and privacy. On the international stage, the U.S. faced the rise of China, alongside a militarily resurgent Russia. The U.S.-China strategic competition became the focal point of the 21st century, spanning trade, technology, and global influence. 8. The COVID-19 pandemic and new crises. In 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic erupted, claiming millions of lives worldwide. The U.S. became one of the hardest-hit nations, with millions of cases and deaths. The pandemic was not just a health crisis. It also exacerbated political polarization, social inequality, and debates over the role of the federal government. Simultaneously, the economy suffered a severe recession, with millions unemployed. The government was forced to launch massive economic stimulus packages to maintain stability. 9. The United States today. Hopes and challenges. In the early 2020s, the U.S. remains the world's #1 economic, military, and technological power, but it confronts numerous challenges. Political polarization. Party conflicts are increasingly intense, and trust in institutions is eroding. Social inequality. The gaps between rich and poor, racial discrimination, women's rights, and immigrant rights remain intractable issues. Global competition. The U.S. must confront China and Russia while maintaining its international leadership role. Climate change. Storms, wildfires, and rising sea levels threaten the lives of millions. Technology and information. Artificial intelligence, big data, and cybersecurity present both opportunities and risks. Nevertheless, the United States retains unique advantages: advanced science, a top-tier university system, a diverse culture, and most importantly, the spirit of innovation and exploration, a spirit that has been integral to the nation's history since its founding. Conclusion of Chapter 8. From 2001 to the present, the United States has undergone unprecedented trials: terrorism, war, economic crisis, political polarization, and a global pandemic. Yet, during this period, the U.S. has continued to affirm its central role in the globalized world, leading in technology, culture, and military strength. The story of the United States in the 21st century is that of a superpower striving to maintain its status while confronting countless internal and global challenges.